Hello everyone, welcome back to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Odin. This time I'm going to be talking about building Odin for the jungle. Now, Odin as a jungler is really interesting because of two rather specific interesting facts about Odin's kit. The first is Path to Valhalla. Now, I didn't really talk about this very extensively for solo Odin, primarily because while the power boost is nice, in most circumstances, whether or not you actually get to effectively utilize the movement speed boost as a solo laner really depends on how mid lane is doing. Sometimes it's gankable, sometimes it's not, and sometimes somebody dies in a perfect time to take advantage of that increased movement speed and make a quick pit stop towards mid, and then assuming you kill one or two people in the mid lane, you can zip back over to solo lane pretty quick as well. But this is relatively infrequent, so I really didn't mention it, right? But it's really important to jungle Odin, because even if you aren't ganking or counter-ganking, if anybody dies, enemy, ally, whatever, Odin is getting a movement speed boost and a power boost, which allows him to jungle a little bit faster. Because of this, there are only a handful of assassins that can consistently outspeed Odin. Everyone else only is able to match his speed, or not at all, with a couple of exceptions. But the ones that I'm primarily talking about are Wheelish, Lancelot. As two prime examples, Mercury from the mid to late game, unless he boosted his movement speed ability first, in which case early game as well, but not many people play Mercury that way. But, back to the point, this does allow him, despite the fact that he isn't an assassin, to not only keep pace with, but even a lot of times outpace his jungling opponent. And the power increase is extremely useful for ensuring that you're clearing these camps as quick as possible, to the point where it's easier for Odin as a jungler to clear all of his camps and have a little bit more time to set up a good gank for, right? Because for a lot of junglers, there's going to be a couple of points in the match where you're making the decision, well, do I have the time to grab this camp, or is this lane going to have too hard of a time, and do I need to be there, and do I have to wait and come back for this camp? Well, Odin, if somebody has died relatively recently, or actually even not even necessarily, but Odin often can say yes to that. Yes, I have time to clear this camp really quick, and then I can go and help out because people have been dying, or I'm a little bit ahead because people have been dying, and I've been getting movement speed increases, I've been getting power boosts. If somebody dies right beforehand, even better. Right? You can really utilize this a lot more effectively as a jungle Odin than you can as a solo Odin. The second interesting thing is Raven Shout. You'll notice the shield health scales with damage. Specifically, that is 50%. So 50% of your power goes into your shield. This makes Odin surprisingly durable for a jungler. A lot of people are often caught off guard when you bust out Raven Shout and you are given this surprisingly large shield. Now, without protections, the shield doesn't last a hell of a long time, but it's still a much larger shield than a lot of people expect. And quite honestly, you will, if you play Odin in the jungle role consistently, you will find situations in which you pop Raven Shout, and rather than trying to fight it out, the opponent just turns and leaves, because they weren't expecting a shield of that size. This does make Odin a little bit more vulnerable to erosion, but by and large, you're getting just as much mileage out of Raven Shout as a jungle Odin as you would as a solo. It's just a difference here of, for the jungler, because this scales off of power, you're getting more shield health, but you don't have the protections, so the shield doesn't last as long. Whereas for solo Odin, because he builds protections, his shield lasts as long as the jungler's without having the power to increase the health as much. Okay, so you can pretty reliably count on your shield in a lot of situations, but just be aware that unlike the solo lane Odin, who still gets affected by erosion, obviously, just not as hard because he doesn't have as much power, erosion will be a bit of a problem for you if they decide to build that, and whether or not they do depends on who else is on your team, whether anybody has shell, etc. But these are really interesting factors for Odin to work with as a jungler. One final kind of half point, the Ring of Spears doesn't seem like it would be incredibly useful for ganking or counter-ganking at first glance, and for a gank, it often isn't, unless you go with a specific process. You see, it's really, really easy as a jungle Odin to bait out a person's escape, follow close behind, and use Ring of Spears. What you essentially want to do is enter the lane with Gungnir's Might charged, so you get that stun. They get stunned, you start attacking them, but you don't use Raven Shout, you don't use Lunge. You can use Raven Shout if you really need to, if you're taking a lot of damage, but you absolutely don't use Lunge. So once they get cured from the stun, and assuming the people, your allies in lane, are also helping you with this, they will likely use their escape ability to get the hell out of there, because they've just recovered from a stun, they've been taking some damage, they're on the back foot now. So they're going to use their escape. Then you jump after them with Lunge, and pop Ring of Spears right afterwards. There are a couple of gods in the game that aren't going to have this work. These ones usually have multiple escape moves. Serket and Fenrir are great examples, but a lot of these are assassins who aren't going to be in lane in the first place. And you wouldn't necessarily want to use this on the enemy assassin a lot of the times anyways. You're looking to gank, so probably the enemy jungler isn't there. If the enemy jungler is there, that's a counter gank. But, at least in an oversimplified terms. But anyways, the ultimate point here is that you can absolutely use Ring of Spears, even on a gank, to lock people down. If you're counter-ganking, you can often use it to punish the enemy for using their escape move to close distance, because anytime there's a gank, a lot of the times, not every time, but a lot of the times, whoever is in that lane on the same side as the ganker is going to use their escape ability to close that distance and help out, in most cases. You can take advantage of that in a counter-gank by slapping down a Ring of Spears around that person right afterwards. Again, you're primarily going to be looking to target the laning opponents. Odin does have a bit of an interesting problem fighting other assassins. A decent portion of assassins, who are the usual jungling opponents, do have a variety of ways of getting out of the Ring of Spears. So Odin is one of those very odd junglers where, while you can hold your own in a fight, because Ring of Spears is so easy to get away from and doesn't hit quite as hard as a lot of other assassin ults, he tends to not necessarily do as well in 1v1s, so Odin is one of those junglers where you want to slap down a whole bunch of damage on the enemy jungler and kind of hope that scares them off, because even scaring them off and forcing them to go back to Fountain is still a pretty big setback for them as junglers. So you really don't a lot of the times want to fight the enemy jungler one-on-one unless you have a level or two over them, or they're already pretty damaged in the first place. But unless you have those two conditions, a lot of the times, unless you get that really significant first hit with the Raven Shout Lunge combo, aka the Bird Bomb, you're probably not going to want to box an enemy jungler, at least in the early to mid game. Later on in the game, that's a different conversation altogether, which we'll talk about, but early to mid game, a lot of the times, Odin doesn't perform that well against enemy junglers in 1v1 scenarios. Okay. Which is often, by the way, why you as a jungling Odin will want to counter gank, because once you start counter ganking and you ring the laning opponent in that lane, your allies in that lane can help you, hopefully, kill the enemy assassin. That's the dream. Again, obviously things don't always work out ideally, sometimes you have no choice, but unless you have some kind of advantage, whether that's in level, numbers, or health, try not to box enemy junglers. A lot of the times you won't fare too well. Even if you win the fight, you're not going to win it by so much that you're going to be able to, say, immediately go after a camp or something, right? But now let's talk about building Odin. Just like with solo Odin, who can run theoretically attack speed and ability based, although again I do emphasize ability based, you can do the same thing with jungle Odin. Now, jungle Odin, ability based, runs quite obviously Boomba's Dagger. Now, you might not know this, but Boomba's Dagger makes level 1 Gungnir's Might You're a great first option for your... Actually, it's the first ability you get is Jungle Odin if you have Boomba's Dagger. The reason why, actually, even if you don't, but I'll get into that in a second, the reason why is because not only do you have the pulse damage and the actual damage of the spear throw itself, which doesn't change with the pulse. You obviously have fewer pulses, of course, if you're going with the one pulse, but you go with the single pulse, you throw the spear, and you get the 30% attack speed, which will allow you to get 25 true damage on your basics to that target, which is incredibly, incredibly useful. And Odin, early on, from level 1 to 2, can very much rely on Gungnir's Might with that first pulse to clear camps pretty damn quickly. It's great. But what about evolving this? Because I want to talk about this now for a very specific reason, related specifically to the second item I typically build on Odin. I typically don't like Boomba's Hammer. There are a couple of reasons for this, and I know a lot of people swear by Boomba's Hammer, and it's not that Boomba's Hammer is bad on Odin. It is, in fact, pretty damn good. I'm going to demonstrate. This is actually fairly effective. It's just not my personal preference. That's the buff camps. I want you to pay attention not to the damage that I'm doing, because that's just a locked-in 75 flat damage. Pay attention to my cooldowns. Now, over the course of that, each time I auto-attacked after an ability hit, I reduced my cooldowns by half a second. In other words, over the course of using my entire kit, I reduced the cooldowns of all of my abilities as I used them by 2 seconds. Well, Lunge was 2 seconds, Raven Shout was 1.5, Gungnir's Might was... so forth, right? The issue really is that isn't as big a deal. The problem here isn't in the cooldown. That's actually the most useful part of Boomba's Hammer. The problem here is that true damage is always 70 true damage, and that's it. And there are better ways for Odin to get damage. Alright. Secondly, you are healed for 80 health, but 80 health at the late game. Remember, you have to be level 20 to upgrade this. 80 health at level 20 is, as you can see, not really a big deal. It really isn't. So I'm not personally the biggest fan of Boomba's Hammer. I think this needs a buff, in my opinion. I think that should be 70 true damage plus 5% of your power or something. But anyways, that's just my digression and a little bit of different healing. What I do really like is Boomba's Spear. First off, you get a little bit more power. Second off, more importantly, you get 10% penetration. Third off, you get cooldown reduction. Alright, you get a lot of great abilities here, but on top of that, when you kill any camp, you get a 10% power boost, which goes extremely well with your power boost from Path to Valhalla. Clear a camp, get 10% boost there, jump into a fight right afterwards, drop that first enemy, or maybe an ally dies. Now you're running at 18% increased power, and then you just keep on rolling, people keep dying, and eventually you get a full-on 50% power boost, because this can stack up to 5 times. 5 times 8 is 40, plus the 10% from Boomba's Spear means a 50% power boost. 50%. And that is an unholy amount of power boost to run, and this is why I really like Boomba's Spear. Keep in mind, we can sort of double down on this by using the Bird Bomb combo, which will do just upsettingly large amounts of damage with this significant of a boost. Because keep in mind, Lunge has a 70% power scaling. Again, Raven Shout has a 50% damage scaling, right? Gungnir's Might has a 20 and 60%, 20 on the Pulse, 60 on the Gungnir. And Ring of Spears is, I believe, a 70, if I'm remembering off the top of my head, but it could be a 75. It's just absolutely mind-bogglingly significant. Furthermore, again, also keep in mind that you can get up to 50 power out of Ring of Spears, which will also be increased. Every 10% you get in terms of a power boost gives you, just based on this passive alone, 5 whole power, which doesn't sound like a lot. But when you're increasing it by 50%, you're getting 25 extra power. That is literally 1.5 of your passive right there. This thing stacks, and it gets unholy. Alright, this is why I prefer Boomba's Spear. Odin, at least specifically, gets far more out of that power boost than he'll ever get out of Boomba's Hammer. Okay? Furthermore, if you like the true damage of Boomba's Hammer, second item, Hydra's Lament. There's a couple of reasons for this. Previous to this year, my usual second item for my boy was actually Soul Eater. However, at 100 stacks, this takes too damn long to stack. This doesn't come online fast enough. It also does nothing for Odin's mana, which he eats through faster than the average jungler, okay? Odin absolutely chews through mana on an unholy basis. And Soul Eater does nothing for this, okay? And as nice as Boomba's Dagger's mana regeneration is, that's only flat 25, which means it's only going to really help you out in the first, I want to say, 5 or so levels. Alright, 5 to 7 levels. Past that really early game, you're going to have a really hard time maintaining the mana without Hydra's Lament. Furthermore, because Odin is a warrior, at level 20 he gets a passive 10% cooldown. You can see this right here. Right, we have already 30%. We have 10% from being a warrior, we have 10% from the Boomba's Spear, because I've left that upgraded, and we have 10% from Hydra's Lament. We don't need Jotun's Wrath, which is the usual second item for junglers, because they want to bust those abilities out as quickly as possible, but Odin does not need that. In fact, running Boomba's Dagger and stacking all the way up to Hydra's Lament, I say stacking like it stacks, but it doesn't, and we're running off of between 10 and 20% cooldown just from this. We have the baseline 10% here, and then I think you get 0.5, yeah, you get 0.5% cooldown reduction per level as a warrior. By the time you're done with this, you're at least level 5, so you're talking 2.5 seconds off of that, so you're already on your way to outpacing the enemy's cooldown reduction, right? And with these two items here, this is 20% right here, 30% on the warrior passive, and you'll get your last 10% from the Potion of Power, which means the rest of our items can be pure damage and penetration items, and we don't even have to worry about cooldown anymore. Alright? To the point where my third item in most cases is the Crusher. Now, the Crusher is primarily being built here for the bonus damage to your abilities, but the attack speed is, again, pretty nice for clearing camps. It combos really well with the first pulse of Gungnir's Might, and we get 10% penetration. So by our third item in, we're already running over 10% cooldowns, right? We have 20% penetration, and we've got a good amount of power, right? We're actually going to knock this back. We're running 78 power, right? We haven't even, this is before even stacks of our passive, or a Ring of Spears, depending on how you want to define that. But great start so far. It's from this point forward that we flex a little bit depending on what we need. Alright, in most cases, regardless of the enemy team composition, I'm running Heartseeker a lot of time. Again, we're getting 10% penetration, so we're at 30% pen here, and of course we know we'll get the last 10% from Boomba's Spear. Right, so we're gonna, when we get to level 20 and we upgrade this, we're gonna have the last of our cooldowns, we're going to have the last of our penetration. That's all going to be taken care of. So this is the last penetration item we need, because the other ones have our 30%. This gives us bonus damage based on target's maximum health. Once we get 150 power, which by this point we may have... You see 123 here, but again, keep in mind we haven't built up our stacks yet at all. By this point, you stand a pretty good chance of having 2 or 3 of your runes. So 15-ish power, you're going to be really close. If you've been really successful in a match, or you've been really good about killing people in Ring of Spears, you might even have like 5 and already be running at 25 and being just under that, right? You might even cross that threshold at the 4th item. It really depends on how many people die in your ring. But I love Heartseeker as the 4th item. This is almost a must-buy. There are some situations in which this isn't. Obviously, if the enemy team isn't tanky enough, this is not as necessary, but even so, it still is pretty damn useful. But there are going to be a couple of circumstances in which you might want to grab something else. Alright? For what? For instance, Professor, you might be asking? Well, I'm also really fond of Brawler's Speed Stick. Now, as a solo Odin, I warned that I don't really buy this unless I'm really desperate for the anti-healing, but for jungle Odin, this is great, because it gives him some great power, gives him flat penetration, which helps him with the squishier targets, and getting a killer assist gives you a field that increases your power and the power of allies. Again, this is going to stack really nicely with Boomba's Spear. This is going to combo really well with his passive, with the boosted power from his ult, the Deaths in the Ring of Spears. This goes really, really well with everything else Odin is doing in terms of increasing his power. So I build this a lot of the time, even if I'm not building it for the anti-healing, I'm building it for that other passive, that power field. Very, very potent. Boom. Incidentally, by the way, if you didn't break 150 earlier, you definitely have now. So I'm really fond of this. In cases of really, really dangerous situations, the enemy team is laying down a ton of damage, I'll go instead for Dawnbringer or possibly even Frostbound, but this is very rare. Just to help keep me alive, obviously, right, we have physical power and health, but my 6th item is usually Runeforged Hammer. Again, enemies in the symbol take 10% more damage. We're boosting our power out the wazoo. You can grab this glyph and go with either the Rune-Breaking Hammer or the Flame-Forged Hammer. This is a little bit less effective on Jungle Odin because you don't have the protections to really make that magic damage do much, but it can be really nice. I'll talk about this a bit different context that operates a little differently on the auto attack one, but a lot of the times I love Rune-Breaking Hammer because if you can, again, sticking with that strategy I talked about earlier where you enter a fight with Gungnir fully charged, you get that stun. Okay? Land that stun, boom, Shockwave and Rune. Enemies are dealing less damage, taking more damage. Immediate Ring of Spears. They're taking 10% more damage. Absolutely go wild on them, right? It's just absolutely unholy. Now, I want you to be really aware. I mentioned that the last 3 items were really flexible. I didn't necessarily mean in terms of slot, what you actually put there a lot of the times. Again, you can swap any of these out for Dawnbringer if you really want a bit more tankiness, just as an, to keep you aware. I also find that Shadow Drinker is fairly interesting in theory, because this basically makes you an even scarier Loki for a brief period of time, so this isn't a bad choice either. This is a pretty fun time. A little inconsistent, obviously, because you're going to be... The real problem with Shadow Drinker on Odin is this is going to break the instant you use Raven Shout to get a spicy bird bomb. So unless you're using this to hide behind something unseen and then jump from behind that thing with a bird bomb, you're probably going to be seen right beforehand. And that gives the opponent in a lot of cases the reaction time they need to not get slammed. So this is a bit inconsistent, but it can be functional if you're really fond of this or you're really good at using this. There is potential here. I just don't work that way. It is fun, but you have to be very careful with this, right? Even if you're trying to use Gungnir's Might, you have to charge that up. The most effective use of this is if you were to slip into an enemy team and then you become visible just as you're slapping down a ring of spears. That's a scary thing, alright? The problem is you have to kill an enemy god for this, so that makes it a little bit more difficult to trigger this and then ult, right? It's a bit inconvenient in that form, but again, there is some potential here for some usefulness. And it does give you increased movement speed, it offers you a decent amount of power, it does give you flat penetration, so the core stats aren't bad, it's just the passive is a little bit difficult to use for a jungle Odin. But anyways, again, just as a reminder, any one of these last 3 items can be swapped out for Dawnbringer or Frostbound Hammer as well. The thing that varies is you can switch up the order of these, and often I do, according to my immediate needs at the time. A lot of the times, I'm building Runeforged as my 4th, and I'll build Heartseeker last. Sometimes, if I actually genuinely need the anti-heal, I'll bump this to the 4th, grab this 5th. Sometimes, I want Heartseeker as my 4th because I really need the percentage bonus damage. You never know, right? Big fan of that as well. So, what order you build these 3 in is going to predominantly depend on your needs at this item, what you need at this item, and what you need at this item. That is what decides which of these you build, or if you go again with one of these or with Shadow Drinker. It is the needs of the moment in the back half of the game that decides what you build in the back half of the game. And of course, Boomba's Spear. Alright. Now let's go on ahead and grab the stacks here. Where are these? Why can I never find them? Change team item stack. Here we go. And now we're at 275 with our passive stacks. Let's kill a buff camp so you can see how gross this can get. Boom. And now we're running at 303 power. Alright. And we aren't in a Brawler Speedstick field. We don't have that, right now. And we can... Here, look. Ain't this fully healed? That's great. Most hunters don't build protections. Yeah. Boom. It's a really effective... You can also see, by the way, that 8% there brought us up from 303 to 325. I'll do that one more time just in case you didn't see, but I want you to see... Just repeat this really quick. Boom. There it is. 303 power. We're going to run on over here. Slap down. Oh, she's fighting this thing. That's fine. And 325 power. 1 stack of the passive. Path to Valhalla. It can get very out of hand very quickly if you just kill a jungle camp before you engage in combat. It just gets upsetting. It really does. Alright? You could even see the shockwave going on. It was just... It's out of control. It can get out of control. And this is generally, again, those last 3 items you can build in whatever order you need at the moment. But let's talk about the fascinating auto attack Odin, because obviously we use the jungle for this, and I kid you not, I build the same second and third items. I still build Hydra's Lament. It's still amazing on Odin. Even an auto attack Odin, you're still doing bonus damage on your auto attacks, right? You still want the cooldown, you still want the pen, you still want that passive for the mana. I still build the Crusher. It's giving you bonus ability damage, it's giving you bonus attack speed. It's still really significant, okay? This is still worth getting. It's the back half of the items that change. Now, obviously, I don't know what that was, but obviously, chin size for tankier comps, right? This goes without saying. But keep in mind, we also have a bit harder access to penetration. You might think, well, Professor, why not Executioner? Well, first off, Executioner can be really great. The problem is that passive doesn't really stack too well with penetrations. First off, you still can build it. It's going to be really just a huge amount of protection reduction on enemies, and it's totally viable. And sometimes I will grab Executioner on top of the percentage penetration for really tanky comps, but most enemy team compositions have 2 people who are really durable, and they crumble pretty damn quick to 40% penetration. I actually personally prefer to run Serrated Edge because it's going to give me a little bit of lifesteal. Not enough to make a huge difference, but it's there. But more importantly, we get some power, we get some move speed, we get penetration, right? We actually get to full 40% penetration running Serrated Edge, and on top of that, we get up to 30 physical power on this, which again stacks really nicely with Odin's passive and the runes from the Ring of Spears. So I'm a really big fan of Serrated Edge on auto attack Odin, and I find this to be incredibly effective. We're going to just assume the enemy team comp here is a little tanky, but not too tanky. So we're going to run Chin Size here. But again, Executioner makes for a great choice if the enemy team is really tanky. I don't really build anything else here. I don't even go for Dominance a lot of the time. You can, if you prefer Dominance over Serrated Edge, go for it. But personally, I'm a bigger fan of Serrated Edge because of that passive it has. And we already have 20% penetration from the other 2 items, and while this does give us 20% penetration on our basic attacks, our abilities, even if we're building auto attack, our abilities still really slap. So I tend to deviate more towards Serrated Edge for that reason. It's giving us just 20% penetration across the board, which includes our abilities, whereas Dominance only gives us that 20% additional pen for our basic attacks, which wastes a lot of the potential damage out of your abilities that you can still bring to bear even with an auto attack build. So I personally don't recommend Dominance for that reason. Again, even if you are building auto attack Odin, your abilities can still slap. Okay? Another great option, by the way, is actually Atlantis Bow, which works oddly well with his passive. Somebody dies, you get the killer assist, Atlantis Bow activates, and now your 4% boosted movement speed per stack, 4 to 20% depending on how many people died recently, now is even more effective because your movement penalty has been decreased by a third. So this actually combos really surprisingly well with Odin's passive. So I'm really fond of Atlantis Bow, and if the enemy team isn't just obscenely tanky, I'll build this a lot of the time. Right, this makes for a great 5th or 6th item. We get some flat pen to help with the squishier targets. It's just an absolutely wild time. Alright. Actually, let's readjust this a little bit here so I can talk about some other stuff. Let's grab Atlantis Bow. Let's double down on that. So we've got all that, right? Of course, as always, if you like Hastened Katana or you really want Golden Blade, that's fine. Golden Blade isn't really something Odin needs. This is primarily used for auto-attacking assassins who don't have a really great AoE, but obviously Odin has 2. Gungnir's Spear and the Bird Bomb combo. So he doesn't really need Golden Blade. You will also notice that I haven't talked about crits. I can and I will, but that's in a bit. But this potential Odin jungler can also splash in Shogun's Kusari. And the reason why is because we've lost the 10% cooldowns from Boomba Spear. And Shogun's Kusari will make up for that. Shogun's Kusari also gives us 30% attack speed. Shogun's Kusari also gives us 40 magic protection. So when we go up to, say in a perfect world, Protector of the Jungle, that 7% protections will go a little farther. Not hugely, obviously, but a little farther. We get protections, physical protections, we get some physical power, we get some attack speed. And this is a really nice jungle Odin that has just a sliver of tankiness without sacrificing his damage. Alright? Because a year or 2 ago, depending on, when you joined, it was not unusual, it was actually pretty damn common, to see junglers splash in a protection item or 2. A lot of them were building Glad Shield. They were splashing Glad Shield in there, because Glad Shield at the time gave a little bit of power, right? Even today, you still see a couple of people throw in a Glad Shield just for a little bit of extra physical protections. But for a lot of assassins, that's going to represent a pretty significant hit to their power, especially now that the power of a lot of items has been reduced. Odin doesn't really have that problem because Odin has Ring of Spear runes, which gives him up to 50 power, depending on how many he has, which is a little better than the average item right now. Before, that was about equivalent to an item, give or take. Nowadays, it is absolutely a little better in terms of power than your average item. So, using your last slot on Shogun's Kusari to balance out your protections and give you some attack speed, despite the fact there is no power there, this is compensated for by Odin's passive. And again, we don't have Boomba's Spear to, give us the 10% power boost, so we don't mind it as much, right? We have the Protector of the Jungle instead for the boosted physical protections, and we run with that for a slightly tankier jungling Odin. Okay? And that is fairly effective. A slight alternative to this is, instead of Protector of the Jungle, run Mannequin Mace. If the enemy team composition has just an obscene amount of auto-attackers, right? Mannequin Mace is going to give them that burn. It's going to burn jungle camps particularly fast. It's going to give you some basic attack damage. It's going to give you a little bit of physical protections. Most importantly, if the enemy team does have all of this attack speed-based people, they're having their attack speed reduced, right? By up to 40%, depending on how many times you hit them. This effect can stack up to 4 times, right? the effect for both jungle camps and for enemy gods. So if the enemy team composition is just really auto-attack heavy, say they have, of course, the usual hunter, say a Ymir support, or Sylvanas, or Fafnir. They have a Soul in mid lane, they have a Mercury jungle, and Erlang Shen as a solo lane. That is a fairly well-balanced enemy team composition, all of which have really potentially dangerous auto-attacks. Mannequin Mace, every day of the week, right? Your physical protections will be slightly less. Obviously, this is 25, this is 30, so you have a slight hit to that. It's really not that big of a deal. But that absolutely works. I only use this in that very hyper-specific situation, though, because outside of the very hyper-specific enemy team has a lot of attack speed comps, Protector of the Jungle, because it does give you power instead of a basic attack damage increase, does more for your abilities. And as I said before, even though we are building auto-attack based, the abilities still really present a lot of damage, so it's worth investing at least some attention into your abilities. And Mannequin Maze just does not do that. So it's really only good for that one hyper-specific scenario of, the enemy team is loaded to the gills with auto-attackers, I should probably build Mannequin Maze. Right? Another thing you can do is not this. I do want to talk about this before I actually get into what I was going to say originally, because I almost forgot to mention this. I don't really build this because seeing wards isn't really that big of a deal to me. Just buy sentry wards. Your jungle Odin, buy the wards, put them down. Right? Not the biggest fan of Seer of the Jungle. If you really like it, it still works really well. It's just that you won't be as tough to kill or hitting as hard in the jungle. Remember, this is a 15% power boost in the jungle, which is 5% more than Boomba's Spear after you kill a jungle camp. You lose that with Seer of the Jungle in exchange for seeing wards. Not worth the trade-off for Odin, in my opinion. But again, that's going to come down to your personal preference. But let's talk crits, because that's a fairly interesting conversation to have. Now, I'm not usually the biggest fan of crits on junglers, because in my opinion, there are largely two ways to approach building crits on junglers. Two main ways. The most straightforward is to run Rage, Deathbringer, right? And then you slap on Demon Blade, because if you fully stack this, and this is the important part, where the stacks... Why do I always lose this? Come on, there you go. We, of course, have 45% crits here. We have 30 crits here, so we have 75%. We grab Demon Blade, that's 95%, close enough to 100 for government work. We get penetration out of this, and we get increased attack speed, which is great. This is actually fairly nice. Right? I'm not the biggest fan of Bladed Boomerang on Odin. They tend to spawn right next to him, obviously. The problem is if you need to bird bomb something, this is gone. That Bladed Boomerang, gone. It is fairly interesting. If you're really, really interested in doing so, alright, because this can get fairly fascinating, you can get Bladed Boomerang instead of Rage. That is an option, because if you're willing to pay attention and grab these boomerangs, these are great, because they're increasing your movement speed, which stacks with your passive, which makes you some kind of greased lightning of bird bomb death in team fights later on in the game. You're tough to get away from if you run the Bladed Boomerang on Odin and you start rolling that passive. You are difficult to get away from. Okay? It is a viable option. Your crit percentage becomes, however, and this is my issue with this is why I don't personally build this way, but it is potentially effective. My only issue with this is that your actual crit strike chance begins to vary a whole lot, okay? Because it's going to hinge on how much you pick these up, how much attention you're paying to them, and when you run this instead of Rage, you are looking, instead of the 45% consistent critical chance here, this is giving you anywhere from 20 to 50% crit chance, depending on how many of the boomerangs you've got active at a time. So your total crit chance with Bladed Boomerang, Deathbringer, and Demon Blade is going to range anywhere from 70 to 100%, whereas with Rage, fully evolved, this is going to be a really consistent 95. Now, I personally prefer the consistency, but if you're okay with the variability of 70 to 100%, Bladed Boomerang is a great option. I will say that normally I would prefer Bladed Boomerang, but as a jungle Odin, with your interest in killing enemies in the ring for your passive, I generally, at least for Odin, prefer Rage. I don't really have a problem stacking this a lot of the times. It does slow down your early game a bit because you're not getting that mana, and in fact, if you're really concerned about that, or if this is your personal preference, because generally speaking, the MP5 out of Eye of the Jungle isn't really enough, so a lot of the times this isn't too unusual. It really depends on how long I expect the match to be. I'll sometimes go Hydra's Lament as a second item, then go Rage, right? Start stacking that. Then go Deathbringer. Grab the Malicious Deathbringer for the reduced cooldown on your abilities. And then go with Demon Blade, and then finish up a lot of the times. A lot of the times I just go with the Crusher, personally. Again, any of the other items I talked about makes for a great last option. It really depends, again, on your needs of the moment. But even with this crit build, because I recommend and often use Malicious Deathbringer here, your cooldowns are significantly shorter than you would expect, right? If we were to, say, grab Protector of the Jungle here, and go after Neath, say, we're going to go on ahead, jump in on this, boom, and then we're going to get all these crits, and you can see my shield coming back up really quick, and in fact, if we can hit these crits often enough, we can almost get our... Here, let's use somebody else. Let's use Guan Yu, because he's going to be a better demonstration. Get that. There we go. Look at that. And before we're even down with the shield, if we can land crits consistently all the time, by the time the Raven Shield ends, we can actually fully restore the cooldown or come pretty damn close to it, right? Boom, boom. There it is. Actually, I think a better demonstration of this can be found with... Get out of my face. Odin's, obviously, right? Forgot about them for a second there. Alright. And if you can land consistent critical hits, you can, in fact, refresh this as it stops working. I just refreshed it before it even stopped working. Again, you can run, in theory, an infinite Raven Shield. Now, obviously, in real life, this is going to be difficult to maintain, because right now I have this undying Odin that's just taking the crits, right? But in a real-life team fight, it is possible to run that. And even if you're obviously not going to be running that the whole time, you're not going to always be able to land auto attacks on people, you are going to be able to land crits on enemies often enough where you can very easily, at the very least, refresh Raven Shield or Raven Shout within a couple of seconds of it falling. Okay? And this does not even include... I would like to also point out the fact, really quick, I did not even use the Gungnir's Might attack speed buff, which makes this even more possible. You'll see every once in a blue moon, obviously, right here, that every once in a great while I don't get a crit, because remember, I'm running Rage here. I only have 95%. There was 2 in a row right there. That's unlucky. But I only have a 5% chance of not getting a critical hit, which means, in terms of internal game code, if they've kept it consistent with how they last talked about it, basically you'll miss 1 out of every 20 potential crits on paper, in theory. How it actually works depends on whether or not they kept that code. But the last time I checked, your crit chance is a percentage of how many of your attacks in the next 10 attacks are supposed to be crits. So if you just have Deathbringer with 30% crit chance, 3 out of your next 10 attacks will be crits. With 95% crit chance, essentially, theoretically, 9.5 out of 10 of your auto attacks are going to be crits, which means, in terms of code, 1 out of every 20 attacks. Again, that's in theory. Whether or not it actually works that way, again, depends on whether or not they stuck with that code as of the last time I checked, which was this weekend. But, as you can see, you can really break Raven Shout very easily. And in fact, we can also instead go with, again, just to keep with the, protections here, keep in mind we do have 230 power here. Totally possible to, again, here we go. Even with Shogun's Kusari instead, you can see how easy I can maintain this. This is a really fascinating way of breaking Raven Shout. But, and you can also see where, actually just one final point on this, because it's a really fun time, how important Hydra's Lament is to this. Because obviously you're burning through a lot of mana here, so having that increased MP5 according to how much you're missing, thanks to Hydra's Lament, plus the MP5 from Shogun's Kusari, really comes in handy here, right? And this isn't even including me using other abilities either. We can just get absolutely out of control, because I've just been talking about Raven Shout here, but this whole mess can get really gross. Alright? And if you're really concerned about, the potential of, oh, they're going to get away from me or whatever, you've got the very much benefit of crits giving you increased movement speed on top of your passive giving you movement speed as things are going down. You don't oftentimes need Hastened Katana to stick to enemies, but this is a really interesting and fun way to break Odin in a very interesting way. The only thing that I really have to warn you about is this is going to make either your early or your mid game a bit more difficult, because it really depends on when you build Hydra's Lament. You build it second item, your early game will be fine, but your mid game will be a bit rough as you're trying to stack this rage, and you're putting money into Malicious Deathbringer. That can get a little bit difficult, right? And even then, even once you get Malicious Deathbringer, it's not going to be until you get Wind Demon online before you really can start breaking this. And then your last item is just going to be a flex pick, depending on what you need at the time. But your mid-game, a lot of the times, is going to be a little bit more difficult. I want you to understand this. This isn't just, a free ride to broken Raven Shield and broken abilities. This is a reward for getting through a really tough mid-game. And if you do poorly enough in the mid-game, that's not going to be enough, right? So I do want you to not just see this and say, oh, that's pretty hot shit, Professor. Let me go run and try that. Well, be careful, because this is also going to depend to some extent on enemy comp. I find this to be very effective on high damage, low defense compositions. The bonus protections you're getting from Protector of the Jungle and Shogun's Kusari will really help you manage the incoming damage from that higher damage comp, and that higher damage comp is less likely to be able to withstand hard-hitting crits. Keep in mind, we aren't running nearly as much penetration here. We're running 10 to 20%, depending on whether or not we've just critted someone with Wind Demon active, right? Obviously, with 95% crit chance, most of the time we're basically functioning with 20% penetration, but it's only 20%. This isn't really a build that I would recommend you go against a tankier composition for. So, yes, this can be incredibly potent, but only on the right compositions. Again, those high damage, low defense compositions are going to tremble in fear of you in late game. Tankier compositions are going to shrug a decent amount of this damage off because you lack the penetration, And crits, of course, don't do as well against protections because they are a percentage increase of the damage you're doing, and the more defense an enemy has, the less meaningful the crits will be, obviously. So I do want you to be careful of when and how you use this, when and how you use some of the other ones as well. Typically speaking, the tankier the enemy composition is, the more likely I am to use abilities, and the less tanky they are, the more rewarding an attack speed build is going to be on Odin. That is my general rule of thumb for both Jungle Odin and for Solo Lane Odin. Okay? Now, one final thing before I end this video. You might be wondering, well, Professor, why not build Crit Odin in the solo lane? Again, if you're looking to run Wind Demon, not Wind Demon, I'm an idiot. What is this called? Bladed Boomerang. You can, but you're also going to be a lot easier to kill, which defeats part of the purpose of being the solo laner in the first place. So I don't really recommend it. You want, as a solo laner, your job is to shore up whatever problem is happening in your team. And if you're building crit build, you are dedicating yourself hard to damage, which isn't going to help if your support is having a really rough time or your team just needs another frontliner. Okay? But with that being said, thank you all very much for listening and or watching. And if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.